So I think it's 2:00. We can officially start. Sherry, does it look like most people are back?
Yeah, everyone who was here before, yes, I think so.
Good, and then some. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Welcome back to those who are having fun with us for the last 2 hours, and welcome anew to those who are just joining us. So we're lucky today to have Sherry here with another hat on. So Sherry, as most of you know, is our executive director, and she's our connection to Leonard. So she's going to be moderating today. Sherry's also the CEO and co-founder of Enthea, and also an advisor to the CPTR course, the CIS CPTR course, and an advisor to Sensorium. So she wears many hats. We're very lucky to have her here as part of the BPRG. We couldn't do this work without all of her help. So I'm going to pass the baton on to Sherry. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you so much, Anne. And I'm so excited for this talk today. I've had the pleasure of working with Leonard a little bit through Enthea, and definitely had the pleasure of hearing his talk at Horizons. I don't know if anyone here also heard it, but it makes me very excited for the presentation today. And I'm going to share a little bit about Leonard. Leonard was alleged to have produced 90% of the world's LSD. He's a former drug policy fellow at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, a research associate in neurobiology at Harvard Medical School, and deputy director of the drug policy analysis program at UCLA. With 2 life sentences without parole, Leonard served 20 years in maximum security federal prisons and was released in 2020. His book, The Rose of Paracelsus, am I saying that right, Leonard?
Paracelsus.
Paracelsus, I totally got it wrong. Written in pencil while imprisoned, will be published in Italian in 2023 and by Synergetic Press. His 1996 prediction of the fentanyl epidemic and recommendations for prevention were confirmed by RAND in its definitive report, The Future of Fentanyl and Other Synthetic Opioids. Currently, he's a senior advisor and on scientific advisory boards for biotech startup funds and the Fireside Project. So without further ado, welcome Leonard, and yeah, very excited for this.
Well, lovely, Sharon, and thanks so much. And hello, everyone at the Boston Research Group. I've known about you for many years and only wished I could have been in the early parties in the backyards before you expanded to the webinars. Let me say a moment of praise to Elizabeth for her work in the Ukraine, who just spoke. I've noted a number of ayahuasca groups that are appearing over there. I think Rick is entertaining the idea of MDMA groups as well. Today, we will do a little retrospective of sort of how it all began. A tour back through 90s, 80s, 70s, and even the 60s in terms of underground culture. This is before medicalization. Let's start by going back. First of all, a shout out to friends in the Boston area. That would be to Peter Grinspoon, Constance G. in Westport, Mass., Deidre Barnett at HMS, Jerry Rosenbaum, Dick Simon, and Steve Haggerty at Symposia, and with whom I've had a lovely dinner and interactions, and all praise to what they're doing. But 22 years ago, if you'll think back what you were doing in psychedelic space, 22 years ago. Let me do a screen share. My first attempt at sharing a screen, so bear with me. "22 years ago, I was on my knees in this frozen field in Kansas with a gun pointed to my head. The police officer saying he was going to blow my brains out. We're allegedly synthesizing LSD. A cold full moon and the Bush-Gore election at the transition of that. And several hours were spent running through the night. I managed to elude a DEA chase team, and being a a distance runner began running through the night up and through creeks, just like in the movies. Brambles tearing at my face, ice cold, freezing. I'd had no coat or anything. Very difficult. One's life going before one's eyes. A new baby had just been born. My own dear family had just arrived. And so I saw their faces receding into the darkness with this horrific, absolute life sentence before me. But at that moment, I was free running through the fields. And then before dawn, I heard the whirring of rotors on the horizon. And of course, that were the search teams, 250 house manhunt, helicopters, dogs, everything rather focused on locating me. I'd hid in a drain pipe in hopes of defeating the infrared sensors that would notice my body. I managed to hide in a remote barn, empty barn of a local farmer, and stayed there all night shivering, hearing the helicopters circling. Eventually didn't see me and they left. And then I asked myself, how did I arrive here? At a lovely position at UCLA. I'd just come out of the Kennedy School a couple of years before. I was doing drug policy work throughout the days. And here I am shivering in a barn in Kansas with 100 DEA agents and local police looking for me. How did I arrive here? Well, it all began in a higher note of levity in the 60s. With the man on the left. That's Augustus Stanley Owsley III, grandson of a Kentucky senator, and the first underground producer of LSD in quantity. Owsley was a great friend and arranged the sound system for the Grateful Dead, made the great speakers for their concerts. The joint smoking hippie on the right, played pretty good music, but we thought he'd never make it. That's, of course, Jerry Garcia in an airport in San Francisco. Owsley again. Owsley at one of the great Dead concerts. This is perhaps 71 or so. Owsley, over the course of his lifetime as the first underground manufacturer of note, synthesized 1 million doses. That's 500 grams. He named it things like White Lightning. They were like double domes, as they called them, 800 micrograms. That's a very, very large dose. Smaller doses, known as Purple Haze at the time. After Owsley came this man, quite a remarkable fellow, and with whom we were great friends in his youth. This is Nicholas Sand, who with Tim Scully formed the Organic Synthesis Center of the worldwide LSD distribution group known as the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Originally founded in Laguna Beach, California. They had links throughout the world, including Afghanistan, large amounts of hashish imported in the United States. This was Nikki as a relatively young person, graduate anthropologist really out of Brooklyn, who came west and was trained to some extent by Owsley in a straightforward synthesis, the Gar brick synthesis as it was called, of LSD. Nikki went on to produce, just a moment, I'm trying to forward this. Nikki went on to produce, this is Nick in his maturity, 13.5 kilograms of LSD. That's, if you go with a DEA estimate of 50 micrograms per dose, that would be 250 million doses of LSD produced by this man. In conjunction with Timothy Scully, his dear partner, who is a spent most of his life as a programmer, the lead programmer for Autodesk. Tim is on the left, Nikki is on the right, and of course in their later years. But these men were responsible for, up until the 90s, the largest amount of LSD ever produced globally of any group whatsoever. Tim is still with us and hale and hearty in Mendocino, enjoying his retirement. Nikki passed away shortly after a MAPS conference a few years ago, in which he was honored by Rick at that conference for his efforts as the chief chemist of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. Here's a blotter with Nikki smiling away. Very, very popular. Nikki was strongly befriended by Sasha Shulgin, whom many of us knew and loved. Certainly the leading medicinal chemist, pharmacologist throughout the 70s and 80s, above ground. Sasha was not a clandestine underground chemist, although he knew Owsley and Nick and Tim and all the underground figures who regarded him as quite the icon. Sasha was, for almost 30 years, before this great wave in which we're in the last few years of medicalization and billions of dollars coming into this space. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there was none of that. And this was together with Dr. David Nichols out of Purdue. Sasha was the only man standing in public. He had a DEA license, an analytical license in his small, charming laboratory in his backyard with his beloved wife, Anne. And in their little home in Lafayette, Sasha, with one of the first and only licenses granted to a single individual, in his small, tiny laboratory, produced hundreds and hundreds of derivatives of phenethylamines and tryptamines, published it in his great work, Pickard and Tikal, worldwide bestsellers on synthetic chemistry at the time of these classes of compounds. Sasha passed away in the last decade and only recently in the past months, but truly beloved in the underground, particularly California. I met with Sasha as he lectured at HMS in '98, extremely well-attended noon lecture, in which he told anecdotes of being thrown out of his dormitory in Harvard Yard for making a small explosion in his window, and to great laughter. Truly a beloved figure. We interacted in Cambridge and Boston and Heidelberg and Amsterdam and San Francisco, and could always see him in a crowd. He was 6'4", 6'5", with a mane of white hair, and spoke very softly and rapidly, and was a true devotee of the art of chemistry, and loved the idea of atoms and molecules and what we could do with them. So we all owe quite a bit of everything to Sasha and to Anne. Farewell, Sasha and Anne. a lovely blotter with an MDMA molecule, it looks like. Might be DOB. Yes. Very well. During the time that I knew Sasha, I was living as a monk, a Zen monk in the San Francisco Zen Center, in formal practice, robes and all of the above, while commuting to Berkeley for classes during the day, and in the monastery at night, and visiting Sasha and Anna in their great Friday night dinners as often as possible. So it's quite a different way of living at the time. Facing the wall, letting the mind subside, letting feelings subside. It was a time of purity and focus. And during that period of purity and focus, I asked, what could I do for the world? Other than underground manufacture, of course. And decided to apply to the Kennedy School of Government. And quite unbelievably, with this esoteric background, I somehow was accepted into their program, thinking that I would be able to speak. The folks at the Kennedy School thought I would be able to speak to psychedelics and the movement in the underground and drug use in general, the legacy compounds, methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine. There was no fentanyl at the time, and indeed I could. So I found myself at the Kennedy School. Lights often on at night as things heated up in Washington, for example, the invasion of Afghanistan, where lights are on at the CIA, where they're eating pizza all night. Lights were also on at the Kennedy School, where people were eating pizza all night and monitoring from a policy viewpoint what was going on in DC. Very lively and loving classes. But interestingly, the government in 2000, after my arrest, suggested that, well, this was all going on at the Kennedy School, and the evenings, or somehow a large quantity of LSD was being distributed throughout the world. And this apparently was one of the blotters, although most, of course, went out as pure crystal, according to the government. Occasionally, small blotter distributions were made. And this allegedly, according to the government, was one of the most popular. It's a collection of Grateful Dead album covers. Let's see if you can see the small white dots at the base, of the edges of each image. Those are perforations in a blotter of about the same size. And within each of those squares that you see in the small dotted lines that look like hyphens would be one dose of LSD. So each image would have perhaps 6 doses of LSD. This apparently was a very popular issue that went out in the early 90s in San Francisco. But during the daytime at the Kennedy School, I fell into the spell and the wonderful ethical direction and standards of probably the leading drug policy analyst in America, Mark Kleiman. Mark Kleiman was also Rick's mentor at the Kennedy School and was strongly instrumental in arranging the early structure of maps, of noting, for example, that if FDA approved a drug, then DA would be mandated to move it to Schedule 2, which is what's going on now. Mark was a drug policy analyst, leading the drug policy analyst for DEA for a number of years in DOJ, so he's quite familiar with all the systems. I was strongly supportive of Rick and his PhD and guided him for years, and was very much loved by his students and his close friends. A very kind man, very accomplished scholar. The Institute of Medicine has just established a grant in Mark's name, inviting participants to read papers in drug and criminal justice policy. Mark, in a more informal matter, with his great beard, occasionally you would see him in a Grateful Dead t-shirt. He did have quite a sense of humor, but was intellectually quite formidable, almost scary in terms of his acuity, but a dear friend with a great heart. Yes. While I was at the K School under Mark, my interest, I was asked to try to predict the next major drug of abuse. This is 96, 97. What is the next major drug of abuse? At the time, there was only methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, occasionally odd THC analogs. So I began reading the literature, the synthetic literature, to try to determine, essay what rough beast this way might come. Drug development doesn't end. Pharmacology always advances. And with it, not only do we have blessings, but we have little horrors that appear. And my charter was to identify what would be the horror. And I came to the conclusion after 2 years of traveling back and forth to Moscow and to look at a small outbreak of this particular drug there. It was very unknown at the time. I concluded that the next major drug would be fentanyl and proposed methods of preventing an epidemic. And the question was this particular drug, a pediatric anesthetic at the time, be appropriate for heroin users? Would heroin users use this? So I canvassed the addicts, if you will, of Boston and surveys and made great inquiries. And among the few that had ever had such a thing, they said, yes, it's completely substitutable. That, along with extreme potency, it's as potent as LSD, microgram range. I realized that we had a problem and began promoting that idea throughout Cambridge, but was asked, do you want to risk your career on predicting this drug no one's ever heard of as being the next major drug of abuse? Even worse was its cousin, carfentanil. A suitcase of carfentanil could be synthesized by a single individual in a single house in Indonesia or Moscow or China, Mexico. And that would be adequate for the global supply of morphine, extraordinarily dangerous. The few labs that have been located with carfentanil, not unusually, one would find the presumed chemist dead, not knowing how to handle this drug due to its potency. So I suggested in 96 that the known precursors to the only a handful of syntheses of fentanyl be curtailed or be circumscribed or be scheduled, NPP, for example, and ANPP. But this fell on deaf ears. It was considered the idea of a relatively unknown drug such as fentanyl being a major drug of abuse was considered laughable, science fiction, fringe, way out thinking. But it occurred to me it only took a single unscrupulous individual who cared not for how many lives were lost to make an adequate amount of this and get it through existing distribution networks for heroin, disguise it as heroin, perhaps as China White, and we would have some problems. I suggested scheduling NPP and ANPP in 96. They were finally scheduled around 2010 in the United States after a 1,000-person death resulting from an outbreak from a lab in Toluca, Mexico. And then worldwide finally in 2017, 20 years after it was suggested that be done. a DEA raid team wearing respirators, DEA raid teams going into fentanyl sites, or for that matter, LSD sites, because they're relatively so potent, tend to wear protective devices such as respirators. But this particular setup would not be adequate because, as you can see the skin showing into the right of the officer's face. That's improper. And of course, just wiping your forehead with the back of a glove in fentanyl's case would be lethal. In LSD's case, you would have a profound psychological experience that might be uncomfortable. At any rate, while all this was going on at Kennedy School and for a couple of years thereafter, I found myself on my knees in the field in Kansas that we looked at earlier. From that forward, after 2 years, I found myself in a trial in a federal courtroom. And questioned as to what my day job was, I suggested, well, folks, let me take this moment to say that while your concerns today are about LSD synthesis, there's a bigger, much graver, far more dangerous problem that's coming toward us called fentanyl. This was in 2003 in a federal courtroom and a recorded federal transcript for 2 days with many exhibits. And only one small local newspaper caught the last sentence I said regarding this topic in testimony and quoted it in 2003. We're going to have a big problem. And I was referring to fentanyl, but it fell on deaf ears in the courtroom. It was considered a diversion. Why are we talking about fentanyl when the topic of this trial is LSD? 12 jurors. We discovered the lead juror is actually an attorney. We hadn't mentioned it to us, and into prison. I told I would be die there. 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Nothing one could do would result in freedom. My small children, babies, gone. Career gone. Most friends gone. You can walk like this. That's a waist chain. The handcuffs are tied to the waist chain, so you can't raise your arms. But what you can't see are the leg chains. You also have handcuffs on your ankles. They're quite narrow, so you can't walk. You can shuffle a little bit. It's almost like an elderly person with Parkinson's, shuffling slightly forward. Very difficult. I lost count of the number of times in this particular arrangement. Into maximum security federal prisons. This is razor wire. Of course, there's no hope of climbing that. Want to be cut to pieces. The only living creatures around were birds that would fly, and pigeons primarily. We saw a few crows. But if they try to go through the razor wire, they would be caught up on that. We saw a number of one-legged pigeons. Others spread out like crucifixes with their wings caught in this particular razor wire. Imagine what it would do to a human. No grass, no flowers, no streams, no trees, no children, no dogs, no cats. just gravel and 30-foot walls, and the fellow in the tower will shoot you if you try to climb the wall and get paid $2,500 bonus in the event of your death. Home sweet home, a typical federal cell with a roommate that's not just yours. It only has a bare floor, no carpeting, no desk really. I guess that you could call that small thing a desk. A very effective toilet. A little window to look out upon razor wire, and those four walls. And that large 300-pound door slams. And that's it. You can get books in quite wonderfully. And if you're lucky, the local FM station may have classical music on. In the course of my transitions, I recall breaking into tears one night after 2 years of not hearing classical, and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony came on with chorale, and I lost it. The neighbors are relatively close. The detritus really of society, we all are. Some have spent 30 or 40 years in that type of environment. I've said goodbye to a number of men at 6 a.m, walking around the track, a young, older black fellow I hadn't seen before was feeling happy. I saw him on the track one morning at 6 a.m, just us out there. And I said, well, you look like you're very happy today. What's up? I haven't seen you before. And he says, I'm leaving today. I just did 40 years. He came in when he was 20. He was a 60-year-old man. I was very happy for him, but at that time I was going to die there. Often, if there's a lockdown, say, for example, due to COVID or to violence or just being moved around, one is, escorted in handcuffs, note the hands behind the back, wherever you go. It's all steel and cement, all steel and cement, like sensory deprivation. Walking to meals. Some institutions in total silence. This is a posed photograph because in the federal system, even though those green uniforms are authentic, in the federal system, the men self-segregate racially. Blacks eat with blacks, whites eat with whites, Native Americans with Native Americans, Hispanics with Hispanics. And that's just the way it is. In the units themselves, that's not the case. People sit together to watch TVs. But in the chow hall, they sit separately. This reduces violence. There's a little bleed over. In the white group, a young black man of gentle nature may come and sit and have conversations. A white may join a black group. There's kindness and tolerance and understanding still, even under the harshest possible conditions imaginable. While I was away, I remained in touch with my mentor, Mark Kleiman at Harvard, who did the most wonderful volume, When Brute Force Fails, on the ups and downs of criminal justice policy and how we might make it more effective and more compassionate and reduce threats to the public. Mark would send me the galley proofs for his books. Princeton Press did this one, Oxford did another. And I would get the great galley proofs and read every word and look for typos or make comments on it. And this gave me a small tendril of connection to the academic community and to beloved friends. So gestures like that were a great lifesaver and otherwise unimaginable caging. You wake up every day to this. And best say, excuse me on the tears if you pass someone. Always be polite. But while in this unusual environment of great violence and beatings and occasional deaths and suicides and interminable captivity, I was still somewhat aware of the developments on the outside. I was aware of Roland Griffith's great work at Hopkins, the transitions around 2014 and 15 as research continued. I also kept track of watching, well, will the fentanyl epidemic ever happen? 2003, 2004, 2005, nothing. 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, nothing. The incidence of deaths from opioids was about 3,000 people a year from pharmaceutical prescriptions. No suggestion of any fentanyl epidemic. That's just science fiction. 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010. Finally, in 2015, there were 100,000 deaths from fentanyl, primarily from Chinese sources. And every year since then, now major Mexican sources spreading worldwide. It's a demon that will be with us likely forever. My only hope regarding fentanyl is perhaps the development of a vaccine or a complete change of heart among those that might use opiates. And that's just the first compound of many that we will see in the realm before us. I tried to keep up with some of the synthetic ideas and saw that fentanyl had moved from a few syntheses to 30 syntheses, so that the idea of controlling its production via precursor control measures from the UN would be unlikely because there were too many precursors, some available in tank car quantities for a few dollars a kilogram. No way to stop this beast. But along with that, fentanyl on a much smaller scale among the hallucinogens, we were seeing variants like this N-bomb, for lack of a better word, a variant on Sasha's 2CB, one of his most favorite compounds. He asked me to evaluate it in 1998. But in the postdoctoral arena in Berlin, a researcher began to do themes, various analogs on 2CB, and came up with this, which was as potent as LSD, but it will kill you. A hallucinogen that is truly lethal, as potent as LSD. This unfortunately began to be shared around India in blotters and made quite a dent in terms of LSD distribution in India. I began to receive emails from young people stating that they'd just lost their beloved friend taking a psychedelic. And of course, that was N-bomb. 20 years of being courteous. What are ants doing here? Did I put this slide in correctly? No. Because there were no dogs or cats or children or flowers, people became grown men, 60s, 70s, 80s, became starved for anything living, anything alive, anything they could care for. Some men would capture mice and make out of cardboard little running wheels and train the mouse to run on the wheel and observe it and feed it and let it run for days. Others would capture a pigeon and hide it somehow in their room for a little bit and feed it or bring it up from a small pigeon to maturity. And some of us, myself included, became protectors of the ants. And the prison yard, it was just dirt and 30-foot walls, but there was a hole or two here and there, and the ants would come out occasionally. And we would steal bread and smuggle it through the metal detectors and beyond phalanxes of guards who would pat us down and shout at us if we were caught with a bit of bread, and somehow get the bread out to our friends, the ants, the only living entities in this dirt. And we'd feed the ants and they would cart it away. And you would see 5 or 6 people standing around, grown men standing around, looking at the ants, hands in their pockets, quietly. Simply starved for anything that one could care for. My room for 20 years. The steel door that you see with the 4-inch wide window is the lights are on 24 hours a day to make sure that you don't kill yourself, and or your roommate doesn't kill you, or vice versa. And the hole in the 300-pound steel door of the window is the guards. 2 guards come by every hour, 24 hours a day, and look in the window, both of them, to see that you're alive. At night, they use a flashlight, and your blanket can't be above your face. So 20 years of flashlights and people peering in the window. Quite an experience. Floor is good for push-ups and meditation. Can't put anything on the walls, no pictures of family or anything like that. The mirror you see above the sink is made of metal, so you can't break it and cut someone or yourself with it. No door handles, because they don't want you hanging yourself with a towel. So what to do for intellectual stimulation? I began to write under the guidance of a wonderful visitor, Professor Emeritus of Poetry and English at the University of Arizona, would come by on Fridays and talk to a handful of people that liked the thought of writing. So I began to write and created this almost 700 page volume, The Rose of Paracelsus, which describes an international LSD group and their lifestyles and values and what they thought about the future. It became quite a popular work. I managed to get it out. Notice the symbols, the chemical symbols surrounding on the left, on the right, and the colors on the cover showing a spill of chemicals. It's difficult to see in this particular issue, but this became a popular work, and is being translated into, has been translated into Italian, and is being published this year in Italy by Mondadori in Milan. I receive emails from readers around the world. Some thanking me for pointing out the discussions of child abuse or other moments of interest in the rose. Michel Devenot, PhD in comparative literature, well-known figure, of course, Michel, holding a copy of The Rose, a great supporter we were in touch for many years and remain so. Within the rows I described, the fentanyl work at Harvard. And the rose was published just as the speculative epidemic actually happened. So I wasn't able to include writing on the epidemic. But just as it's published, 100,000 people started dying, and among them were this married couple with a little boy in the back seat wondering what's going on with mom and dad. It was very difficult being in prison watching the fentanyl epidemic occur, not just because of tragedies like these, but the thought of how it could have been avoided had we tried harder in the late 90s to awaken government and policy people to the likelihood of this occurring. But we couldn't see the future. Around 2019, the RAND Corporation found a lot of the early work, the transcripts from the 2003 trial, a lot of the early overheads describing the 96 fentanyl prediction. Mark Kleiman was instrumental in getting these records to the RAND Corporation, which was doing a great study on fentanyl at the time. And they validated the 96 prediction, the 2003 warnings at trial, and published it. RAND, of course, is the defense policy analysis arm during the Cold War, thermonuclear warfare. But in the later years, they've gone into drug policy and designed the protocols for example, Uruguay, and to a lesser extent, Jamaica. In Santa Monica, 2,000 PhDs worldwide. They published my work in The Future of Fentanyl and Other Synthetic Opioids, the definitive study of fentanyl. Many citations, chapter 3, based on the Harvard work. And we brought this to the attention of the federal courts in an attempt to reduce the sentence from life. A petition for release and letters of support came in from a number of people, among them theoretical physicist Carlo Rovelli, whose works are in every bookstore on cosmology, extraordinary writer and a great heart, a tremendous gentleman who was reached out from France, having read a copy of The Rose, and said, "How can I help?" and wrote a lovely letter to the judge. As did Julie Holland, friend since the early 90s, and now, of course, a prominent speaker and psychiatrist in New York City. And Ben Sessa of Bristol University and Imperial, now CSO of Awaken, working on ketamine clinics in the UK. And with the kindness of these friends to the court, and the kindness of Brother David Steindl Rost, a 93-year-old Benedictine monk from his monastery outside Salzburg. Brother David is a worldwide reputation. TED Talks have 6 million views. He said the opening prayers at small conferences at Esalen involving Rick, myself, Sasha, Anne, Mark Kleiman, a number of people, a group of 14 people in 93, where we all gathered at Esalen to ask, what is the future of psychedelics? And how can we help? Brother David opened that conference with a prayer. In my last year of captivity, I befriended the young fellow front row on the left, Ross Ulbricht. Ross is well known as the developer of the Silk Road, a Bitcoin trading platform. Was given life in prison for an offense which has been cloned and duplicated, and people are getting more like 5 years. But Ross, as the poster boy, if you will, for trading platforms, received life in prison. A meditator, a gentleman, thinker. I do what I can to help Ross, and I said I would, if I spoke publicly, I would always mention him. He cried the day I left. Another young man lost in the system forever for nonviolent. When I step into this world in which we now inhabit, and I see $1 billion and many eyes and distinguished researchers all focusing on that which was only a few years ago, lest we forget, forbidden. One risk one's career. Discussion of psychedelics was fringe, laughable, an absurdity, kooky, and now considered perhaps, in some instances, psychiatric savior for certain indications. Cybin, Compass, Atai, MindMed, all started by young men who had certain vision, and after Roland's great work, no difficulty acquiring investment, now being handed off to more practiced CEOs. An extraordinary firm like Gilgamesh, which does ibogaine analogs, the great work of Jonathan Sporn, CEO, and the organic chemist, chair of chemistry at Columbia, Dali Sames lab, doing a wide variety of ibogaine analogs in an attempt to reduce the cardiotoxicity to make it acceptable, with remarkable, truly remarkable anecdotal reports of healing, great healing from opioid use disorder. And we're seeing this abroad quite commonly. So it's great hope for clinical trials of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh just received $30 million additional investment from Y Combinator. So research continues. Even DARPA has gotten into the act and attempt to handing out about 20 million to researchers in an attempt to separate the hallucinogenic effect from the healing effect. DARPA speculates that this can occur, meaning that the drug may be taken home, used as a more common pharmaceutical. It's a division in the community is whether or not this is true, whether the hallucinatory effect can be separated from the healing effect. Some feel that it cannot, but many startups are based on this concept, and DARPA is funding that. They certainly don't want their war fighters putting down their weapons after a transformative night. AI is coming in relatively strongly, as it is in big pharma. We're seeing any number of startups in psychedelic space using AI to not only configure the molecules for potency and lower toxicity and different effects on different receptors, but also to search the world's chemical libraries and botanical libraries for promising new drugs. We're quite an era that we're entering now. So the question is, will it all go back to the early beautiful days of the 60s, in which long-haired, gentle people walked about dreaming dreams of the future? Or perhaps it will. Perhaps it will. So I end with simply a rose. Normally, in a talk like this, I would read a small sample from the Rose of Paracelsus, but I'll spare you that today and simply open it to questions. So that's generally a synopsis of my story, and I hope you found it of interest.
Thank you so much, Leonard. That was very, very touching. Actually, most of the BPRG group don't know this about me, but my dad's brother, my uncle, was actually in maximum security prison for 11 years for a drug-related charge. So I'm happy my video wasn't on during your talk because it was quite emotional to see those images. So
I'm so sorry.
no, it was wonderful at the same time because I'm glad you could share your story. So thank
Glad
you.
you made it home.
Yeah, me too. So thank you so much. I'm sure the group has lots of questions. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm selfishly going to start with a couple myself, if that's okay. First of all, I'd love if you could tell us more about the underground history of LSD.
Well, there are a few things that are not truly public that might be of interest. Well, let me just start this way. A new book is coming out by Norman Ohler. Norman is a German fellow that some years ago had a great success with a book called Blitzed, which concerned methamphetamine use among in the Nazi regime. Something of an esoteric topic, but a very good seller and good reviews. And his new book is called LSD for Mama. He has a mother with Alzheimer's, and they are treating her with microdosing and suggesting that she's become more creative and outer-directed and even dances a little bit. So this intrigued him greatly, and he began looking into LSD. And he went to Basel, met Albert's entire family, had great tours, saw Albert and Anita's grave sites, and then found himself over at Novartis, a giant Swiss pharmaceutical firm, which subsumed Sandoz some years ago. So Sandoz was, of course, where Albert was when he synthesized LSD. Norman was permitted into records heretofore not shown to the public, the 1943 records of Sandoz regarding the discovery of LSD. Heretofore, the consensus was that Walter Stoll, chair of psychopharmacology at Sandoz, was the second person after Albert to be exposed to this compound, but Norman has discovered is actually Albert's secretary, a 27-year-old woman who was the second person exposed, and Walter Stoll was the third. So the book is replete with anecdotal material, some of which I assure you will be quite controversial as the American community reads it. It's now coming out in German translation first, and the English will be out shortly. But I would refer you to that for more material. In terms of the 60s, when the first major deployment went out, not Owsley's million doses so much, but certainly when the Brotherhood of Eternal Love began their major deployments, 10, 20, 30 million doses out of San Francisco, all over Northern California, throughout the United States and the world. This was 66, 67, hence the Summer of Love in 67. Great congregations of young people coming throughout America to arrive in San Francisco. Hence the song, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair. Those are remarkable, remarkable times. I can recall dancing in the streets, spontaneous aggregations of 20 or 30,000 people just for no particular reason except to share the sunshine and, pass cannabis about and dance and sing and speak of their experiences with these substances. There were no older people to talk to about it. There was no internet, no computers, no cell phones. There was no one to talk to really over 30, only a handful, about these great transformative nights of the soul and the phenomena, the myriad phenomena that can occur and almost unpredictably. And so only the young people had these experiences, only those brave enough to risk their minds, frankly, on extraordinarily experimental, potent neurochemical. The word spread, people began trying it out, and they could only talk to each other because, speaking of a transformative experience to a person that hasn't had one, is a bit of a risk socially, but among the youth, it was not. And so we all kind of grew together, bound together as a young tribe. And now that tribe is older. I was 21 when the first wave hit through San Francisco. And having lived a life in the community, arguably, according to the government underground, it's quite something to step into the world now where people are not afraid, as you all here today are not afraid to come out and speak, to say what you learned in your youth or more recently. It does not risk your career. It could advance your career. But it was not always that way. There was a great deal of suffering that went before. But it was an honorable path in retrospect. And even more honorable now with clinical trials and appropriate controls and training. It's a magnificent time. I anticipate great medicines to be discovered, although I don't support the idea of every indication being treatable or every psychedelic being useful. I think some will be for some indications significantly. And so we're on the precipice of a revolution in psychiatry and neurochemistry, one that will go on forever.
Thank you. I'm really curious if you could speak more about your early prediction of the fentanyl epidemic.
Well, in the early 90s, there had only been about 10 labs discovered worldwide that had produced very small amounts of fentanyl, very small amounts. And interestingly, those labs were all people with very advanced training. They're all doctoral level chemists. One was at DuPont. One was professor of chemistry at Minnesota. One was at the Naval Research Laboratories in DC. And that was all precipitated by an article in Chemical Engineering News, which was talking about a fentanyl analog of great potency. And this attracted their attention. And so only these highly trained individuals could synthesize this, and they did. And then they had no idea what to do with it at that point, who to give it to. They can't start handing out doses on the street. People of that nature didn't know any addicts or addict population or dealers. They were eventually arrested, but none of it made it to the street. Okay, so we have an idiosyncratic drug. It's almost impossible to synthesize by an untrained individual and no distribution network. Case solved. So the view of it was by the government. But after a few years, I noticed an article on a young fellow, a Mexican national, that was killed in a car accident. And in his pocket, he had a simplified synthesis for fentanyl. A simplified synthesis can be done just by cookbook methods. It won't be pure. It can be extremely impure, but that doesn't really matter because the impurities have little or no psychic effect. The fentanyl has quite a profound effect. So even if it were 30% fentanyl and 60% various impurities, it would be extremely usable and lethal, and indeed it was. And so these simplified procedures began to appear on the internet. And at that point, the number of individuals that could synthesize fentanyls that were usable went from a handful of people, say at the Naval Research Laboratory, to anyone that could read and was so motivated. So it began expanding that way. And once it entered the distribution networks among opiate users, the wildfire began.
Yeah, I wish more people had listened to you. There's a question from the group. Henry, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sherry. And yeah, deep gratitude to you, Leonard, for this presentation. So my question is, Roland Griffiths himself has said that psilocybin was a really good candidate as a substance for the clinical trials because it lacked, call it the political baggage of LSD. But I'm curious if you think, if anything, we're leaving something on the table and what that might be without more emphasis on LSD. And I wonder, say, is ketamine sufficient? Is this work without the emphasis on LSD sufficient? And yeah, very interested to hear your view on that.
Well, I'm in venture space. So that means that each week I see many of hundreds of pitches for psychedelic startups. They're now at least 600 around the world. Some valued at several hundred million, others at 10 million, others at 3 million, proliferating rapidly. And happily, though, LSD is not being left behind. Quite a number of the more prominent ones have LSD study programs. So we're not forgetting the parent compound, if you will, for so many. Roland, I think, is right in terms of political baggage. LSD is a scary word for many, and provoked the harsh government response in the 60s. So I think he's correct in that way. The other advantages of psilocybin are simply the duration of effect, 3 or 4 hours, relatively narrow. It's a little gentler. It's hard to take such a dose that you might find yourself in real trouble, a theological confrontation of great magnitude, gentler. So I think Roland, politically, of course, had to go with psilocybin initially. It was a great ask anyway for permission to do that. And he was made the right choice. In terms of ketamine, the ketamine startups are also growing rapidly, and we're hearing tremendous reports of positive studies, and not just anecdotal, but control studies and the journals of psychopharmacology. That's all quite wonderful. But I come from a heritage where things like ketamine, so closely related to PCP, was disfavored. A dissociative anesthetic is not a psychedelic. I see pitches of ketamine pitches now where it's talked about the psychedelic effect, as though the buzzword is being used or being hijacked for the promoting ketamine. I'm not saying that ketamine has no real effect. Bill Wolfson, of course, has done great work on that in San Francisco. But I feel that whatever works, whatever heals the traumatized war fighters, the harmed mothers, those that have had child abuse, people that are intractable with depression, hallucinatory, non-hallucinatory, ketamine, analogs, legacy compounds, whatever works, whatever significantly works well is just fine.
Thank you so much for that. Sherry, is there time for one more follow-up question?
There are so many good questions right now in the audience.
No worries. I will excuse myself.
Thank you.
Mika in our group has a question. Mika, do you want to ask your question directly?
Sure. Hi. So I was very taken with certain aspects of your book in terms of actually the descriptions of locations all over the world with such fine detail while you were in prison. So I'm curious what resources you had in order to kind of paint the picture of whatever the Alps or or all those locations around the world. And also I'm curious if you could at all speak to the question of which parts of the book should be considered fiction as opposed to memoir.
Let me answer that last one first, because I'm often asked, is it fiction or fact? And the fun part is I can't say it's fiction. Now that can provoke quite a philosophical dilemma. When you're talking, for example, about a chapter in Berlin, which involves an erotic encounter in which a woman is being exorcised of a demon, a cocaine demon. Well, is that real or not real? Well, that would require you to think about modern demonology. Is that real or not real? Is pain or abuse or addiction, is the neurological construct for that, if we went back into the medieval area, equivalent to the idea of being a state of possession? Is a serious addiction to state of possession? That would depend upon your religious background and your references. Of course, it's a neurological construct, but if you didn't have the medicine or the science to describe it in any other way, would you describe it as a state of possession? So in the writing of that chapter, I wrote it that way. The reader has to decide on his own what to take home from that. But generally, the scenes are written from memory. I had no source material to answer an earlier question. I had no source material about the nature of Salzburg or the nature of Bangkok or the nature of Oxford, but I had to rely upon a vanishing memory of the world. You know, after the first few years of looking at a cement wall, the great cities become dim and disappear. All of the walks through the mountains or by the seashore become increasingly pale. The images of one's loved ones, picture your child's face, become more difficult to recall. You know, the world really does diminish. That's the result of isolation, or being put in environments where you don't see colors. Everything is gray or brown, the dirt brown, or gray of cement or steel, and that's it. So before the world disappeared, I tried remembering the beauty. The majesty. As best I could before it left. And wrote down in English, in our beautiful language, as clear a description as I could. It's like leaving something beloved behind in one grasp, frantically for its memory to hold it close to one's heart. And the words were the only thing that would make it stop and hold, and I could read them again and again and refine them. And then again, writing was kind of like singing a death song. You know, during the writing of that, the likelihood of being released was unimaginable. And so I asked myself, what could I say or do that someone somewhere in the world might read and find some beauty in there, something touching, or something, a poem to an era and a time and a feeling, as we now share in this group that was shared by young people many years ago who gave their lives for it. And to leave a small record that someone might read of those times and that promise and that dream. So it was a little song. I'm so glad you heard it.
Thank you. There are so many questions, Leonard, in the chat, great ones, and people messaging me as well. And I don't know if you're able to see how happy people are with your talk, but I want to make time for just one more question. James, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sherry. Leonard, wonderful to meet you. Wow.
Lovely to meet you as well.
Thank you so much for your talk. So my question is, what made you decide to go down this path? Like, was there a particular event or experience that made you decide to risk it all and do this work?
Well, you know, in the 60s, we were, when we were very young, I was, 21, we're embarking down the road of paying attention to this class of compounds. I saw among the young people a new character. There was an acceptance of each other, a tolerance of different ways of life, a happiness, a vision of a future of peace throughout the world, of the end of the war, the cessation of materialism, of evolution from our current species that involves hatred and wars and machines and autonomous weapons, a movement toward being even more gifted with greater hearts and open minds. And I saw that so many young people realizing that they did have minds, that they could appreciate the aesthetic of the world. They could rever the great forest. They could feel the movement of the mother oceans. They could have sensations they'd never felt before that were benevolent, benign. They felt the unity of all living creatures. And just talking about these things with each other was not seen before. It was like a great tribe growing with a great new mind. We were the next species. So there was really no choice for it to go that way. And here we are now, at this very moment, all together, speaking of these things in the medicalization context. And that's quite wonderful, because not so long ago we couldn't, and now we're free. So if these things work, let's find out with excellent, unimpeachable research and find out the truth one way or the other. Our hypothesis may be wrong, but our science should be excellent. Let's find out together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. I'm gonna make time for one more question. It's so hard because there are so many. Pierce, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Sherry, and thank you, Leonard.
Thank you.
Hey, I just wanted to ask if there were any specific tokens of insight or wisdom that you gained from your experience with psychedelics that you were able to then later turn towards during your hardship in prison, knowing that there may have been a large time gap between those experiences. But I'm just curious if you were able to turn towards that or lean on that wisdom that you gained.
Well, it's kind of hard to believe you're right when you're sitting in a federal penitentiary surrounded by guard towers, being told you're being kept there away from society for the rest of your life because what you think is wrong. It's really hard to remember that you're right. Presumably right, that good science will tell us, right? A lesson to be learned. Not so much the lesson there, but a lesson that is certainly a theme throughout the Rose, in which I would I caution people and caution young people. That the ultimate revelation, at least from what I can determine, there's a scene in the Rose where a fellow is inadvertently exposed to 10 million doses. So people are asking, well, what do you see out there? What's the ultimate revelation from this enormous amount of psychedelic? And the conclusion was, and the thing I often say to young people is that these substances have, wonderful effects, often quite remarkable and stimulating of almost religious import. But underneath it all is our natural mind, the mind we had when we were 8 or 9 years old, before any drug, before cannabis, before coffee, before anything. The mind of a happy, delightful child learning about this glorious existence, that mind. That's underneath it all. And we go exploring with these different compounds. Some are quite extraordinary, as we've talked about today. Some are little monsters like methamphetamine and heroin, or alcohol. It just takes so many loved ones. So the substances can be extremely dangerous. And even those that we were fond of, MDMA, psilocybin, what have you, must be done occasionally, if at all. It's like after you've read the primer several times, there's no need to read it again. And so I caution young people, and the take-home lesson from the Rose is the natural mind is supreme. That's where we came from. And if we're lucky, that's where we get back to. And I caution against polydrug abuse, even among psychedelics. people that want to take, oh, I'll take one propionyl LSD this week, and oh, I'll take this variant of 2CB next week, and on and on and on. But one can spend years searching among analogs. And what are you really searching for? Well, I think the lesson that I learned and the lesson of the writing is to rever the natural mind. And it's not a drug. It's ourselves. It's our pure, fine minds and strong heart. And nothing can be better than that.
Thank you, Leonard.
And thank you.
So,
Thank you, Sharon.
yes, thank you so much. I'm sad to say that we have to end soon, but I want to thank you, Leonard, for your strength, for your courage, for sharing, for showing up the way that you do, for your resilience, for so many things. This has been a great honor to have you here. And I know we have Rick talking Speakly, but I don't know if everyone wants to unmute and applause or thanks, Leonard, but this was
Thanks so much, Sherry. And thank you, dear friends in Boston. And go get them, Rick.
Well, thank you so much, Leonard. Thank you, Sherry, for beautiful moderation, beautiful words at the end. I couldn't have said it better. And thank you, Leonard. You're welcome to stay on. I always say Rick is our dessert, but boy, you have to be a really sweet dessert after you. Your wisdom and grace was just amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure it will be.
Yes.
Much love to you. Take
Leonard,
care.
I just wanted to say that your intuition at your 21-year-old age that this was the way to go was right back then.
Many blessings to you, Rick. I'll sign off. You take it away, okay?
Okay.
More power to you. Congratulations on the positive outcomes of the phase trial.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it works.
You stay well, my friend.
Thank you, Leonard.